In 1960, not long ago in the calendar of history, a new Navy began to emerge. The ships of this new Navy would be atomic-powered. Now this new Navy has come to life, the most flexible instrument of sea power ever known. USS Enterprise, CVAN 65. She's really something to see. But maybe to understand this ship and all she represents, you'd have to have grown up with carriers. Started out years ago when the old Langley CV-1 was little more than a gleam in some dreamer's eyes. That was way back in the early 1920s. About the same time, in 1921, the Navy set up a series of tests. The bombing of captured German warships slated for scrap. Taking turns, Army, Navy, and Marine Corps pilots bombed a submarine, a destroyer, and the cruiser Frankfurt. Anchored and defenseless, they were easily hit, and all three sank. The big show was the bombing of the battleship Ostfriesland. After a second low-altitude attack with 7 2,000-pound bombs, Ostfriesland went down. And Army General Billy Mitchell, who led this attack, almost convinced America that surface ships were obsolete. We didn't agree. It wasn't a question of whether planes could sink an anchored and undefended vessel. They'd done that. But what struck us was the promise and the idea of using planes to defend these ships and extend sea power. Rear Admiral William Moffett believed wholeheartedly in the idea. Moffett took the Navy's case to President Coolidge. He named a number of prominent civilians, the Morrow Board, headed by Dwight Morrow, to determine basic aviation policy for all our military services. So, in this somewhat skeptical atmosphere, the USS Langley CV-1 emerged. She was an experiment at first, a flight deck built on an obsolete collier's hull, an airport sent out to sea. Lieutenant Commander Chevalier made the first landing on the Langley deck in 1922. For the next few years, Navy pilots and the Langley crew worked hard to master the complex techniques for handling both the carrier and her plane. hard way, but we learned to land on her deck. We also worked hard at learning to take off and at air navigation, gunfire spotting, and aerial gunnery. The early 1920s also saw the development of catapults, arresting gear, a faster elevator to clear the flight deck, safe fuel handling techniques, a landing light system, and all the other hardware needed to launch and land, to refuel and maintain aircraft at sea. All our early work was complicated by the progress made in aircraft design from 1925 to 1930. Engines were increasingly bigger and more powerful. Planes got heavier and yet flew higher, farther, faster almost every day. As the speed and range of our planes increased, the original mission of naval aircraft as fighters and scouts and gunfire observers for the fleet began to shift. Pilots began to experiment with different methods of bombing. We dropped everything, even delicate submarine torpedoes, in a continuing search for new methods of attack and defense. All this while, we were doing more than learning the mechanical and flight techniques of operating the carrier and its planes. We were also developing carrier doctrine, the theory of how the naval air arm should operate, including some new ideas of the strategy, the maneuvers a carrier-supported fleet might use in war. Not everyone always understood the big changes underway. In 1926, the Morrow Board had refused the Navy a separate air arm. This was a disappointment to men like Admiral Moffett, who even then foresaw war in the Pacific and the role of naval air and carriers in that war. But Moffett took it gracefully, I thought. Hell, he said, we won't secede from the Navy over this. We'll take it over. So what we'd learned on the Langley was applied to two new carriers that joined the fleet in 1928. The USS Lexington, CV-2, was the first of these. Then came the Saratoga, CV-3. Lexington and Saratoga were improvements over the old Langley. But as carriers, both were compromises. The best we could do with converted cruiser hulls whose flight decks had to take increasingly faster and heavier planes. But both the Lexington and Saratoga served us well. It was on their flight decks, in their shops and hangars, in their wardrooms too, that we worked out the operational techniques that made our naval air arm the best in the world. With Lexington and Saratoga, we also proved the basis of our whole carrier doctrine much earlier than you might think. Admiral Joseph Mason Reeves was one of the first to advocate independent carrier strikes, apart from carrier operations supporting the battleship line. Reeves was one of the first to prove the effectiveness of a carrier-centered task force. Fleet Problem 10 was held early in 1929 to test naval and shore defenses of the Panama Canal against a conventional battleship attack. Reeves left his safe position behind the line of battleships approaching the western canal locks from the north. He brought Saratoga through a wide sweep south of the canal zone. Then he turned back north to approach his target along an unexpected course. We took off from the Saratoga at 2 in the morning while still 200 miles at sea. Nobody'd ever done that before. missile locks at dawn with a beautiful high-altitude crisscross dive bombing attack. Nobody's ever done that before either. We took the defenders completely by surprise. Joe Reeves was delighted. So were we. We knew this was really the first unveiling of carrier aviation. Others knew it too. A year later, Lieutenant Commander Forrest Sherman, later Chief of Naval Operations, advocated a fleet formation that anticipated the carrier-centered task force. Meanwhile, planes kept getting faster, heavier, farther ranging. And there were plenty to choose from. In the early 1930s, Navy test pilots found themselves flying one new model after another. Some were dogs, but others, like the F-4B, became workhorses for the fleet. This rapid development of aircraft had a profound influence on carriers. The USS Ranger, CV-4, was the first carrier built from the keel up as a carrier. But by the time she was commissioned, she was too small and her flight deck too short. Her arresting gear was unable to handle the faster and heavier planes still coming along. Not until Yorktown CV-5 was commissioned in 1937 did we get a third assault carrier to join Saratoga and Lexington. By this time, flight techniques and aircraft design had progressed enough to justify steady building. Enterprise, CV-6, and Wasp and Hornet, CV-7 and 8, were all commissioned before 1941. As these new carriers joined the fleet, we continued to sharpen the techniques and tactics involved in their use. During fleet maneuvers in 1938, Vice Admiral Ernest J. King foreshadowed the Japanese attack of 1941 with a practice strike against Pearl Harbor. Ernie King was a cantankerous old curmudgeon, but a genius with carriers. He followed his Pearl Harbor attack with a successful strike against Mare Island Navy Yard. In 1939, King's Carrier Division 1, the Saratoga and Lexington, was joined by the new Yorktown and Enterprise, making up Carrier Division 2 under Rear Admiral William F. Halsey. Together, Ernie King and Bill Halsey gave us a preview of how World War II was going to be fought. And so on the eve of that long-foreseen war with Japan, the planes, the carriers, the doctrine, and the great carrier commanders who'd lead us to ultimate victory were there. Fortunately, none of our carriers was at Pearl Harbor on December 7, 1941. After that carrier-based Japanese attack, no one, as Admiral Nimitz pointed out, could doubt the effectiveness of naval aviation. When Enterprise and Yorktown came back to Pearl from raids in the Pacific early in 1942, the carrier's significance was fully understood. We on the Yorktown followed Halsey in. There was the pick and flower of our Navy in shambles. And yet as we passed this wreckage, cheer after cheer went up from the men who had taken the Japanese attack. Because they knew it would be men like themselves, led by men like Halsey, and the carriers and their planes, who were going to win this war. The great carrier-led assault began almost at once. It was first dramatized by the Halsey Doolittle raid on Tokyo from the Hornet in April 1942. Their target was hundreds of miles away when these B-25s took off in weather that wanted to wreck the world. Then the carriers and their planes really got underway. Now we really hit the Japanese Navy in the Coral Sea in May 1942, at Midway in the following June. The Japanese came to Midway with 4 carriers. We sank all 4. This helped to ensure our successful landing on Guadalcanal in August. It was never easy. When the war began, the Japanese Zero fighter was the best naval airplane in the world. With 3 times the rate of climb we had, Japanese pilots could outrun us or catch us when we tried to run. They could turn inside of anything that flew. We had to get back on equal terms with the enemy. And we did. We developed tactics like the thatch weave, relying on teamwork between our pilots to trap and evade the enemy and to shoot him down. We also developed better planes. First, the F-6F. Later, there was the F-4U. Meanwhile, Essex-class carriers joined the fleet. Now, under Ernie King as Chief of Naval Operations, with Nimitz, Halsey, Mitcher, and Spruance, we swept across the Pacific from victory to victory at sea and in amphibious invasions ashore. From the Marshall Islands to the Marianas, the carriers moved on. By then, we were really a team. We knew how to bore in on the enemy and stay on his heels. In this great drive across the Central Pacific, the carrier and her planes came into their own. The Battle of the Philippine Sea in June 1944 brought out the Japanese fleet and cost them 3 more carriers and most of their remaining planes. As Admiral Nimitz pointed out, a truly secret weapon of the war was our ability to replenish at sea. What we had learned even in World War I refueling destroyers at sea, and all we had learned during fleet maneuvers between the wars stood us in good stead. By the time we came to the Battle of Leyte Gulf in October 1944, the Japanese were desperate. Now they resorted to desperate measures. Suicide attacks by kamikaze pilots who turned their planes into human-guided missiles, hoping to sink our carriers. Most of the kamikaze pilots were shot down. But we took some hits. After Okinawa and Iwo Jima, the war was all but over. You can say this of carrier performance in World War II. Carrier strike forces, Japanese or American, always defeated land-based forces. The issue was in doubt only when there were carriers on both sides of the battle. It wasn't until after the war that carriers knew another threat. This came from the new high-speed jet aircraft. Their speed and weight and the added load of the original heavy atom bomb first seemed to indicate that any jets meeting other operational requirements might be too heavy and too fast for carrier landing. But the first jet carrier landing was made by an FH-1 Phantom in July 1946. The first jet squadron qualified on the Saipan in May 1948. We were still in business. But as jet performance and weights increased, we were headed for trouble, back where we'd been with Ranger in 1934, with planes too fast and heavy for the flight decks from which they had to operate. This became increasingly apparent during the Korean War. We began to hear an echo of Billy Mitchell's old argument. Carriers, all surface ships, were obsolete in this age of atomic weapons and jet airplanes. Yet, even before the Korean War was over, we were well on the way to solving the problems we faced. Flight decks were strengthened to take the heavier weight of landing jets. In February 1952, we were taking a second look at the old catapult for launching these heavy planes. In June 1954, the first steam catapult went into operation on the Hancock, kicking off over 250 aircraft of many types. Meanwhile, in 1952, we began looking into the idea of an angled deck on which high-speed jets could land without danger. The first angled deck was installed on the Antietam. Steam catapults and angled decks were incorporated into Forrestal-class carriers that began to appear in the mid-1950s. From their 720-foot decks, we could now launch jets carrying atomic bombs and oncoming long-range fighters like the Mach 2 F-4H. By 1955, we were working out a better landing system for these faster planes. A mirrored landing system was installed on the Bennington. On the Midway in 1963, fully automatic landings were made hands-off, with both flight controls and throttles operated by signals transmitted from the carrier. And so the carrier survived, evolving into an even more effective ship than those whose names are legendary: Langley, Saratoga, Lexington, Yorktown, the earlier Enterprise of World War II. This is the new Enterprise. She's something to see, all right. A complex instrument of war or peace, just barely dreamed of 50 years ago. A shining example of our new Navy and of sea power at its best. "1941 was a memorable year in the annals of the United States Navy. And it also marked the beginning of the Navy's Combat Artist Corps, a program that now has its own traditions, its own history. Some of its pioneers: Commander Standish Backus, Hugh Cabot, and Commander Griffith Bailey Kowali, the first official Navy artist on active duty. And since there have been many others that through their creative dexterity have truthfully recorded those vivid points in time that make history. Because of this effort, millions of people in America's towns and cities have had the advantage of viewing the full spectrum of Navy history over the past quarter century. Reminders from the past: Midway, Coral Sea, Tarawa, Salerno and Omaha Beach, Seoul, the Yalu River, and today, the strange names of Southeast Asia: Chulai, Da Nang, Na Bay. In 1964, the program added a new dimension by utilizing the talents of non-military artists. And this is how one combat artist tells his story. The point in time, May 1967, on the flight deck of the veteran carrier USS Hancock off the coast of Vietnam.
To me, the most unforgettable feature of carrier operation is the fantastic number of men required behind the scenes. With With 900 men directly engaged in air operations, many hundreds more below deck seldom see this hustling deck activity. Undoubtedly, the most spectacular items of the ship's equipment are her catapults. These giant slingshots can hurl 24 tons of airplane into the air in just over 200 feet. Everything in flight operations is in a high key. You have screams of jet engines, exploding afterburners, the kerosene-scented wind, the accelerated actions of the men, the many brilliant colors. They all compete for attention in a picture of precision and teamwork. With each launch, mission responsibility is focused on a handful of men with the job of disrupting southward flow of enemy war supplies. And when they return, there's an air of homecoming, something stirring about it, like a flag passing in a parade. Whatever it is, you can't watch it sitting down.
Point in time, 800 feet over the Rungsat, one of the nastiest jungles in the world. This 400 square mile area, lying between Saigon and the sea, is a treacherous network of dense jungle and waterways, and the site of extensive Viet Cong activity.
My first glimpse of the Rungsat told me, I can't paint this, no one would believe it. Because from the air, this twisting maze of waterways looks more like a medical illustration than Tideland's geography. The principal waterway, the Long Tao River, is a 45-mile lifeline to Saigon and to South Vietnam itself. In this terrain, the enemy can easily hide himself and his supplies, as well as manufacture a crude assortment of weapons to harass river traffic. The job of controlling the Delta region's waterways is shared by the U.S. Navy and the Vietnamese National Police and Customs Service in an operation called Game Warden. And from this riverbank office, the senior American advisor directs the Rungsat activities of our river patrol boats and minesweepers, the mainstays of Operation Game Warden.
Point in time, with the Sea Wolves, the Navy's first and only light helicopter attack squadron, as unique and deadly as their environment. Here at the Na Bay Naval Base on the fringe of the Rungsat, as well as from ships deployed throughout the Delta, these small gunships give Operation Game Warden the quick reaction firepower to counter Viet Cong activity.
In a typical helicopter airstrike, a forward air control aircraft discovers and marks a VC bunker with a smoke grenade. Now the helicopter moves in and sprays the target area with all 6 machine guns to suppress enemy fire. This allows the pilot to aim and launch the helo's primary firepower, a total of 14 devastating 2.75 rockets. But this isn't all the Sea Wolves do. They are frequently called upon to pick up VC prisoners, or, as you see here, they often serve as artillery spotters. And as daylight fades, Sea Wolf action reaches its peak when the legitimate river traffic is halted by a nightly curfew. This is the signal for the nocturnal VC to take over the waterways. But it's also the signal for the Sea Wolves to strike the enemy one more time before night falls.
Point in time. A penetration mission deep in Viet Cong-held territory with the Navy SEALs, an organization considered to be the most deadly combat team in military history. This is a new breed of Navy man, and as a highly specialized countermeasure against enemy Delta operations, their harrowing storybook tactics are becoming legendary examples of fighting quality and discipline.
Nighttime in the Rungsat is no longer the uncontested domain of the VC. The SEALs are there too. Mobility, stealth, highly developed self-control, and refined covert tactics are their fighting tools by which they gather the vital information necessary to counter daily enemy activity. Guided by the SEALs intelligence reports, another specialized organization, the Joint Army-Navy Mobile Riverine Force, furnishes a muscle to neutralize trouble spots throughout the Delta. Operating from barrack ships near the coast, small armored troop carriers, along with heavily armed river gunboats, represent our first full-scale riverine force since the Civil War.
Point in time. The Marine Corps Air Station, Chulai, with one of the Air Force Tactical Air Control Units. These small, highly maneuverable O-1C aircraft are fittingly called bird dogs, in the sense that they seek out and pinpoint targets with smoke rockets as a guide to attack aircraft.
Forward air control is an essential ingredient in performing close air support for ground forces, since today's high-velocity aircraft does not permit the pilot adequate time for target identification. Once the target is marked, the bird dog must quickly make an exit to make way for the Phantom jets attacking with 750-pound bombs. Following the airstrike, the bird dogs must then conduct close-at-hand assessment of the damage inflicted. Dozens of patched bullet holes on these small aircraft attest to the danger of this phase of the air controller's job.
Point in time, with our combat artist at Marine Air Group 13, Chulai, the staging area for supersonic Phantom jets that perform the important role of close air support for Marine ground troops throughout Vietnam's northern provinces.
You don't simply climb into the world's fastest, most high-performance military jet and go for a joyride. Before you can get close to the airplane, it takes days of indoctrination, ejection seat drills, decompression chamber and physical qualification clearance, and jungle survival training. But at 18,000 feet, at 200 miles from the target, it's difficult to believe you're in the center of a military conflict with the stillness and sheer beauty that surrounds you. Even the familiar demilitarized zone, the center of bitter fighting, looks peaceful below. Once the target is hit and you're on your way home, another anxious moment may be in store for you. Phantom jets absorb fuel at a startling rate and often require fueling in flight by Marine C-130 flying gas stations, a delicate and precise maneuver.
Point in time, with a medevac crew in Vietnam's rugged Central Highlands, where heavy-duty UH-34 helicopters serve as a vital lifeline by supplying beleaguered Marines with food, water, and ammunition. And equally important, medevac's quick reaction in battlefield rescue of the wounded is responsible for saving countless American lives.
The UH-34, the Marines' workhorse, is basically unarmed and stripped for action to get in and out of emergency conditions on the ground. Working in pairs, one armed helicopter remains aloft to suppress enemy ground fire as a protection for the vulnerable hover or landing phases during emergency medevac or resupply. Also, medevac's military missions are frequently interrupted to alleviate civilian emergencies in the numerous villages beneath their flight path. A war, under any conditions, is an awesome and tragic event. But when it's there, it's fertile ground for the artist. For when bravery and deeds are commonplace, it bears the full spectrum of human emotions and brings the quality of the human spirit to the surface. And I, for one, feel privileged that I had the opportunity to participate as a combat artist.
And so, with the brush and palette as his working tools, this man joins the growing list of military and civilian artists that will continue to enrich our understanding of these points in time that make history.